Hello everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I believe in my last video I promised to start uploading a little bit more regularly. So I believe what I meant by that was once every 2 years or so. So it's been about 2 years, so I'm back ready to do this again. To get back into the swing of things though, I thought I would talk about some of my recent tournament games. So today I'm going over round one for my most recent tournament, the Midwest Class up in Wheeling, Illinois. Hosted by the Continental Chess Association. And in this first round game, I was playing a game in 60 because I was playing a shortened schedule for the event. And my opponent is a strong kid named Ruoshao Xia. Sorry for that pronunciation. Anyone who speaks languages I do not. And let's just jump into it. So I played d4. My opponent played d5. We get c4, e6. I play knight to c3. And the point of my opponent's move order becomes apparent after bishop to e7. So a lot of players have been told to play the Queen's Gambit declined in this move order because it might dissuade their opponents from going knight c3 due to the threat of the Nimzo Indian, quote unquote. Now, obviously, I'm fine with allowing that, so we would get to a similar position, but my opponent chose this one instead. Why did he do that? Well, he did that to go bishop e7 instead of knight f6. So this is a very interesting move order for black to get into Queen's Gambit declined type positions. And it's normally combined with one of two very specific ideas. Well, that is to say, white does have the option to play knight f3 when we would transpose into some normal variations, but I play the exchange QGD, after which black generally tries one of two very, very common ideas. So the point of this opening is that this g5 square is not available to my bishop, so I have to put it on this square instead. Now, why is that such a big deal? You might assume black does this because g5 is just the best square for white's bishop, and we would much rather have white put it on f4, but I'm going to go ahead and argue that that is not exactly the case here. f4 in many, many ways is a better square for white than g5. Shocking, I know. So let's take a peek at the main line and try to understand why we're not putting this bishop on f4 here. It turns out we don't put this bishop on f4 because this move bishop d6 is quite a strong reply by black. After something like bishop d6, queen d6, black is going to have very free early development, and we'll see some ideas that might look familiar in the main variation as well. Black can bring this bishop out to f5, activating all the pieces very early on, and isn't going to be under any pressure at all early on in the game, in my opinion. So why do we put this bishop on g5? Well, because if we put it on f4, bishop d6 might be quite nice, and if we start delaying the development of our pieces, okay, black can go c6. And then we're going to have to do this anyways, because if we go bishop f4, again, bishop d6, just a very, very reasonable idea. So that's why we put it on g5. Now, what is the actual downside to putting this piece on g5? Well, you'll see that this bishop might become vulnerable to some ideas later on in the game. Something like h6 can oftentimes be a very useful move for black, even more so if it comes with tempo against white's bishop. Other than that, I'm sure you're familiar with some ideas of knight e4 later on in positions. I think this is called like the Lasker or something or other. But a lot of these ideas hinge on this bishop being a little bit vulnerable on g5. Even ideas sometimes of putting a knight on e6 have been played, targeting this guy. Lots and lots of ideas. So, in the game, this is why this idea of bishop e7, forcing white's hand to play bishop f4, is actually the downside for black. You might assume it's the upside, but it's the downside that white has this bishop on f4. Black is not so happy about this piece being here. Black only does this to achieve one of these two ideas that I keep talking about. So idea number one is perhaps the easiest to understand. It's bishop d6. So despite it being down a full tempo compared to if white had gone to f4 voluntarily, black is still very, very happy to just put this bishop on d6, trade off these pieces, and play this position down that tempo. This has been done at the highest level a number of times with mixed results, but This is one of the main ideas for black in this bishop e7 move order. Now, the other idea is a bit more common, which is to go bishop f5. This, of course, is a very, very desirable move for black, and this is usually why players with the black pieces would choose this move order. It's to go bishop f5 in this position. Now, why is bishop f5 so good? It's not so hard to understand. White wants to go bishop d3, black wants to stop it, so they go bishop f5. If white ignores it, goes bishop d3 anyways, I'm going to get bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, and because we've traded off white's best minor piece, the super powerful bishop on d3, black is more or less just going to be fine in these positions. So why this move order? Why not just do this in the normal QGD? Well, let's take a look at that. In fact, this has been tried and is still a normal idea for black, but the downside here is that we have this move queen f3 when this pressure on f6 might actually become relevant. For example, bishop g6, bishop f6, queen takes, pawn takes. Black is going to have to be happy playing with this structure on the king side, and this is just not something that appeals to a lot of players in my experience. This is not at all the most common line I have faced. Okay, we finally understand bishop e7. Why bishop e7? Well, it allows white to play this move bishop f4, but black is okay with it because it introduces this bishop f5 idea when we no longer have queen f3. Now, the downside, of course, is white has other ideas, as is always the case in chess. The main idea potentially being g4. Other ideas include knight g to e2, coming to g3 with tempo on the bishop, getting ready for some h4 ideas as well. And just buckets and buckets of fun here for both sides. Now, my opponent might not have known any of this because he chose the move knight f6. And with this move, it sort of betrays that black doesn't really understand why he's playing the moves that he's playing in this opening line. Now, I spent quite a lot of time on that to get to move 6. Looks like 7 minutes just explaining these nuances. But I think it's really important because now I know exactly where I stand in this opening. I know I am going to have a good version of the normal lines. That's going to let me treat my position like it should be a good version. I'm going to have opportunities not normally available to me. My opponent is going to be missing some critical ideas that would potentially equalize in other positions. And it's going to give me a little bit more confidence in my position, which is a dangerous thing in chess. And it's also why it's important to understand how your opening variations relate to similar variations in your opening. If you're going to play the QGD, I would recommend looking at these other lines, even if you're not going to play them, not just looking at the theory behind them. Like I said, we're only on move 6. It's not exactly a highly theoretical, task to know 6 moves. But understanding why bishop e7. Why do we play bishop e7? It's for these ideas. And then what ideas does white have, and what ideas do I have in response? Now, why bishop e7 instead of the normal move knight f6? Well, it's because of bishop f5, because of bishop d6, because of these ideas. This is why black chooses this opening. With all that in mind, I used all this knowledge to develop my pieces to the normal squares. Okay, so black castles. I go queen to c2, taking advantage of the fact that this pawn on h7 is a little bit weak. Now this knight can't really move, and h6, a move that would otherwise solve this problem with tempo, no longer comes with tempo. So I would be winning a tempo over the normal lines if black chose to play h6. My opponent chose knight b to d7, just getting developed, and I opted for knight g to e2. Potentially knight f3, the computer likes these variations a little bit more, perhaps because of white's control over the e5 square, thanks to this bishop. And then black makes a second pretty big mistake, in my opinion. They choose this move b6. So the thing about these Carlsbad, Queen's Gambit decline structures is you could spend a lifetime studying the ideas and the nuances in these positions and still not really get to the bottom of it. There's a reason why Carlsen has a reputation for really enjoying the Carlsbad with both sides. He has a tendency to outplay all of his opponents, and he's sort of making a run at being the best chess player of all time, thanks in large part to his ability to play these positions at such a high level. So with all that in mind, why does that mean that b6 is a mistake? Well, it's just showing your hand a little bit early with black. The Queen's Gambit declined in these exchange QGD positions are not necessarily the kind of positions where you can follow some recipe and then say, and now I've fully equalized. You can't just be like, okay, I developed all my pieces, now I want to fix the problem of my bishop on c8, so I'll go b6, c5, and be fully equal. It's not quite so hunky-dory in the QGD. You need to play with a bit of patience. You need to play a lot more improving moves like rook e8, knight f8, maybe knight g6, maybe then you go b6, maybe you go c5 without b6, or maybe you wait and allow white to commit to something like f3 or like a3, b4. Because once white does commit to something like this, it's going to give black a lot more direction as to what they should be doing. If I do commit to a move like f3, that's going to make a lot of ideas for black a lot more powerful. So once f3 is on the board, now c5 is going to gain in strength immensely because I've done quite a bit to weaken the dark squares in my position. So after f3, maybe then black should consider playing moves like c5 a lot more seriously. And conversely, maybe if I'm trying to go over here with something like a3, b4, that can be a signal to black to try something like a5. Maybe think about even pushing b5, an idea that's growing quite a bit in popularity in these QGD positions, and sort of meeting me here on the queen side. Basically, you don't want to show your hand this early when you have plenty more useful improving moves that you can play just to sort of improve your position while you wait to see what the correct ideas are going to be. So with b6, it's not so much that it doesn't make sense for black to play for c5, but it tells me exactly what I should want to do with my pieces. So what does b6 tell me? It tells me, okay, black is going to be playing for c5, so now all that I have to do is think of where I want my pieces to prepare for the c5 break. I'm no longer really worried about b5 from black because, okay, it's just a bit inconsistent. Why go b6 just to go b5? I'm no longer really worried about maybe ideas in the center, ideas centered around knight e4 or around maybe bringing the pieces towards the king side for some kind of attack. Now I'm pretty sure my opponent is planning to play c5. So I can fully commit my pieces to countering this idea. Now the engine spots a more tactical idea. It just says, okay, b6 just wastes too much time. Let's go checkmate the guy, play g4. Taking advantage of the fact that this knight is immobilized for the moment, thanks to this pawn on h7 being hanging. And the lines here get a little bit crazy. Wants to go g6, f3, and after f3, of course, c5 becomes better, but in this case, you know, it wants to do some sort of long-term attack, pushing h4, h5, trying to checkmate black. Now, it's game in 60. I didn't really even consider the move g4, but even if I had, I might have shied away from it a little bit just because it seems like it's making a complicated double-edged position, albeit a good one for white, out of a position that I just felt I was going to be better for free. So instead, I just castle to start with. We get bishop b7. And then the first move I play that's really been dictated by b6 is rook f to d1. I said to myself, where do I want my pieces in the event of c5? And it turns out I thought, I want my rook on d1, I want this other rook on c1, and maybe I want to do some long-term reorganizing of the minor pieces, but one thing's for certain, I want to put my rooks in the center of the board where they can help target the newly opened d file after c5, when, in all likelihood, some trade of these d pawns, my d pawn for the c pawn is going to happen, allowing me access to this d5 pawn. So rook f d1 is now very, very easy. And this is why I think b6 is such a huge practical mistake, even if objectively it isn't the biggest mistake of the game. It's a practical mistake. It just tells me what I should do. I turn my brain off. I say, okay, you've played b6, you're playing for c5. Where do I want my pieces? Okay, now I know my next 4 or 5 moves, or at least I have an idea of where I should be looking for my next 4 or 5 moves. No hard decisions for me in this game to this point. My opponent now does choose to play this move h6, and once again, highlighting the fact that I would be down a full tempo now if my bishop were on g5, and the game had gone exactly the same. And now I play sort of the most cryptic move of the game, I think, for a lot of people. I chose this move bishop g3. I think it would have been very, very reasonable to play rook a to c1, just, again, preparing for c5, been very, very reasonable to play a move like h3, giving this bishop some more space. But I chose bishop g3 because I wanted to reorganize my pieces to allow for knight f4, again, preparing for c5, preparing to target this d5 pawn. Now, my opponent was quite friendly and chose the move c5. Now, I've been doing the best that I can to get ready for this break and make sure it's going to be as good for me as possible. And because of that, maybe black should shy away from it a little bit more. The engine liked this idea of knight h5. I also think this is very, very reasonable. Just coming to take this bishop, I would likely go knight f4. We might see a trade. And, okay, in the long run, maybe black is going to just have to live with this weakness on c6 for a bit, because it's really no longer feasible for black to play his idea. But stubbornness in chess exists, and so my opponent chooses to go c5. I come out with bishop f5 now. So why bishop to f5? Well, for one, it opens up this rook to help target the d5 pawn. Number two, it discourages black from bringing a rook to c8. And number three, it steps out of some ideas of c4 with tempo, which might get a little bit tricky or nasty for me. And here, my opponent chooses the move a6. And I think this was potentially the hardest decision point for me in the game. So here the game could go in a few different directions. And my next move is dictated based on how I evaluate all these different positions. So what do I mean by that? Well, we have tension in the center of the board. So that means that there are a few things that could happen. Number one, we could keep the tension. Nobody breaks the tension just remains, and the position will remain in flux. Okay, that's number one. Number two, I could break the tension by playing d takes c5. And following this move, we could get two different structures. Number one, my opponent could try to take back with a piece, something like knight takes, giving himself an IQP. Now, in the event of an IQP, I have done pretty well to prepare for this outcome. I could continue with knight to f4. I have a ton of pressure on the d5 pawn. I'm very, very, very happy. Now, outcome number two is black could take back with the pawn, get this hanging pawn structure. And again, this is going to keep the position kind of in flux. There's not pawn tension necessarily, but black is going to have options to keep changing the structure. d4, maybe c4, leave these pawns here for as long as possible. And I want to be ready and able to get an advantage no matter which way the position ends up changing. I have to be ready to meet d4. c4 isn't really desirable for black, giving me some extra squares for my pieces. But I want to be able to get some type of advantage here. So that's outcome number two. Number one, we keep the tension. Number two, I break the tension. Number three is if I pass, black can break the tension by taking on d4, again, getting into these isolated queen pawn positions, or he could break the tension by pushing forward with c4. So now that we've sort of enumerated all these possible outcomes, the question is, what are we going to do about it? So the one that I started with is what happens on d takes c5. This is where calculation comes into play. So if I take c5 and black tries to take back with the piece, I think I might just be winning a pawn directly with the move knight to f4. I just have a ton of attackers on this pawn, and I don't think black is going to be able to weather the pressure in the long term. I can double up my rooks, do any number of things, if not just win tactically with e4 ideas at some moment. So I wasn't really concerned about some piece takes, either bishop or knight. It's really going to be a similar position. Now, it was pawn takes that actually stopped me from playing this line. It turns out white does have an advantage here, and I thought I might in the game, but I thought I could do better. So what's the big danger here? For black, the danger is having to resolve this pawn tension in an unfavorable way, or obviously the nightmare scenario is you just lose one of these pawns. So following this, I thought maybe I would play something like knight f4, try and pressure this guy. I saw that black could keep the pawn with knight to b6, and it looks like my pieces are pretty well placed. I mean, I can continue with rook a to c1. I can continue by preparing to break somehow. Maybe I go b3, maybe I go queen b3, try and put some pressure here. Maybe I go a4, aiming for a5 to destabilize this knight. I have a lot of good options to put some pressure on these pawns, and it doesn't really look like d4 is going to be achievable for black anytime soon. But at the same time, I wasn't certain of these things. I didn't see any way I was concretely winning in these positions, so I opted not to go for this one right away. So now, after knight f4, I wasn't really at all concerned about these positions, because again, I thought the IQP was just going to be too weak. And the question was c4. So this was the big debate that I had in my head. Was I more scared of knight f4 c4, or was I more scared of dc bc? Which one did I think gave me the easier advantage? And this position I thought just was a bit more complex and a bit more double-edged, right? Black's pieces might get active someday, and my pressure might sort of fizzle out against these pawns, in which case black is going to be able to try to push one of them, try to get an active position. So I chose this move knight f4, further adding pressure to the d5 pawn, and sort of trying to induce my opponent to be the one to break the tension. So my opponent could have and should have actually gone c4. But I wasn't so afraid of this idea because I already knew I had a very strong plan against it. So without this pawn keeping the tension on d4, white is going to be very ready to go f3 and e4 now that we don't have to babysit our d4 pawn and our dark squares. And I thought that this would just be breaking through faster for white than for black. And it turns out I was correct. The computer says it's a little bit better than +1 here for white. Black is going to try to get play by pushing on the queen side, but I'm going to push in the center, and it really looked like my play was just going to get there first. For example, no time to even go a5, b4. Just going to go e5, come knight e4 next, break into the position, and I thought black would just be busted. Now, black can play a bit better than this bishop c6, a5 plan, but that seemed like the most direct, and it seemed like it was quite good for me. And my opponent actually agreed. He chose rook to c8, keeping the tension himself, but now I was quite happy to take on c5 because I've eliminated this possibility altogether of bc, because black just isn't defending this pawn enough. And now after rook takes, trying to defend the pawn, black's pieces are just a bit awkward, and tactically, I think white might just be picking up the d-pawn for free, essentially. So that's really where the game happened here. In these very, very short few moves, we had the opening where I had some small edge because my opponent's inaccuracies with bishop e7, knight f6. And then after the opening, my edge continued to grow because my opponent committed himself to the c5 plan, and I was able to very directly place my pieces to oppose this plan. Very concretely, all of my moves were targeted towards stopping c5, and so of course I'm going to have a good position after c5. And then my opponent chose the incorrect way to resolve the tension. He had to try the c4 idea to get play on the queen side. And that's really all it takes to get close to a winning advantage, right? Black misplayed the opening slightly, and then allowed me very easy play in the middle game, and then chose incorrectly at the moment of truth for resolving the tension in the center. Okay, so I take c5, rook c5. Now I get to bully my opponent's rook a little bit. I come knight d3. He chooses rook to c6. And in the game here, I thought about playing bishop d7. Tactically, you cannot take back with the queen due to knight e5 with a fork. And after knight takes, it looks like I might pick up this pawn. I can go knight f4, attacking this pawn a lot. But somehow insanely, after knight f6 and queen d2, I've added 4 attackers to the d5 pawn. But after rook to d6, my opponent gets to 4 defenders as well. So I don't pick up the pawn. In 2 moves, I had 4 attackers on a pawn, but my opponent in 2 moves gets 4 defenders on the same pawn. Kind of a weird line that I was calculating. But okay, I don't want to give up my bishop if I'm not going to win that pawn, so I played queen to d2 instead, which is perfectly fine. And here is where my opponent starts to misstep a little bit further, and the advantage goes from sizable to just directly winning. So what black needs to do here, even though it's quite difficult to do this, is give up. I have a joke with my friends where if you're playing blitz, oftentimes I'll think for a little bit and then I'll just say, I give up, and play like a normal move. And that's what black needs to do here. Give up on the d5 pawn, just start playing good solid chess, improve the pieces, and just play down a pawn. So what does that look like? Well, you can play rook e8, knight f4, d4, I think is the best way to give up this pawn. And after queen takes, you get to bully my queen a little bit. I'll come back to c2, and then something like maybe knight c to e4. And okay, black is down a pawn for nothing. Nobody's going to dispute that. Great position for white. But at the very least, that's the only bad thing that's happened to black here. The other pieces are getting active. We're activating a little bit. We've got this active knight in the center, and black is still going to be in the game with the fighting chance. What happens instead is black stubbornly tries to keep the pawn. He goes bishop to d6. I go knight f4. Same idea, to try to just attack this pawn until I can take it. And my opponent says, well, I can stop you from doing that. That's why I played bishop d6. Now I'm going to take f4. And after you take f4, hopefully I'll have enough defenders now that I've eliminated your knight. But all this really serves to do in a practical game is gives me another advantage in the bishop pair, and now this unopposed dark squared bishop. And in return, black still just has this weakness to babysit. It'd be one thing if black gave up the bishop pair in order to trade this pawn for the e-pawn, getting rid of his only weakness. Now that might be still a little bit of an edge for white because I have the bishop's pair, but at the very least, you're not still stuck with the same weakness that led you to make this concession. So now, rather than just having a weakness, I have two bishops and the weakness, and that's how this advantage just kind of starts to spiral. My opponent tried rook to c4, then I did a little bit of calculating, saw that after b3, this rook doesn't really have any good squares, comes back to c8, and now I can just play e4, which is just directly winning the d5 pawn as well. So now not only did my opponent give up one of his better pieces, the dark squared bishop, for a knight, but I'm winning the pawn as well, and it was all kind of for nothing. Now, rather than just being a pawn up, I'm going to be a pawn up with the better pieces, with the active bishops, with all the threats in the position, and that's just enough to win the game. So e4, my opponent tried rook e8. I, of course, took the pawn. Oh, to go into the tactics, you can't take this guy, of course, because I have too many attackers here. And at the end of the line, my knight hangs, but so does your bishop. Go bishop c6. You interfere with the rook. I can save my rook. And I'm just going to be up a full piece. So that's the tactic there. So rook e8 instead. I went ahead and took on d5. Opponent tried g6. Come back to h3. Now after g5, my opponent is threatening to win a piece with g4 if I move this bishop out of the way. But it doesn't take long to calculate here. Bishop takes g5 is just going to be a winning attack for white. If king to h8, there are a lot of ways to win. Maybe the easiest is to take d7. Knight takes, check, and rook d3. Come to g3, give checkmate. Queen takes a knight. Not so easy. But my opponent chose king f8 instead. Went queen h6 check. Don't even think about coming to e7. That's going to be checkmate. So king g8, and now still just rook to d3. My opponent tried knight e5, rook g3 check, knight g6, and here the game ends in another two moves. There are a lot of ways to win here with white, but the move bishop e6 I thought was the cleanest and the prettiest. Pinning the pawn to black's king, threatening rook takes g6, checkmates. He tried rook e6, de6, and then there's just no good way to solve these problems for black, so my opponent decided to resign. Just takes, and takes is sort of unstoppable here with, checkmate following rather shortly. So hopefully that explains a lot of the ideas in these Queen's Gambit declined positions, how a little advantage kept growing and growing and growing until suddenly, next thing you know, it's move 30 and black is checkmated. Thank you all so much for continuing to subscribe to my channel over the past 2 years. I think I've gotten like on average a sub every couple days, which is kind of amazing for someone who would abandon the channel for so long. So I appreciate that a lot. Hopefully you do stick around for more videos, and hopefully I stick with it as well. No promises. Maybe it'll be another 2.5 years before you see me again, but hopefully not. Okay, as always, my name is Caleb Denby. Thank you very much for joining me. Have a wonderful day.